Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Karen Tucker. I'm CEO at the Churchll+Club, and I'm very pleased that you chose to spend your evening with us tonight. The topic of the discussion is cities and the digital frontier. We have a diverse group of accomplished visionaries here tonight to talk about this topic, the trends, their implications, strategies in play, lessons learned, and what they believe the future holds. Katharine Frase from IBM, David Gann from Imperial College London and the Smart London Board, Mezher from Parsons Brinckerhoff, and Mike Steep from PARC, and our moderator, Michael Chui from McKinsey Global Institute. Welcome, and thank you all very much for being with us. First, a few announcements. This program is the brainchild of Mike Steep of PARC, who contacted us with the suggestion and offer to help. We owe Mike and also Kelly Rieger of PARC a debt of gratitude for bringing this high-quality, important discussion to us, and especially to hold it here at PARC, an institution with an illustrious past and a very bright future as well in the business of breakthroughs. A special thanks also to our friends at Osborne Clark. We've had partnerships with them over the years, and they are a supporting sponsor of this event. So thank you to both of those institutions. The Churchll+Club has been operating here in the Bay Area since 1985, a nonprofit organization with the mission to encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. We do this through up to 40 or so programs that we present each year in the interest of connecting people with new ideas and with one another. We humbly and respectfully ask our speakers not to pitch, and also to think of themselves as advancing collective knowledge and building on insights that are out there instead of repeating them. And we hope you'll get a lot We hope you'll get a lot. Those things are important, but this is a special place to perhaps treat topics differently. We hope that you will get a lot out of the time that you spend here tonight, and also that you will participate in the audience Q&A that will start at about the 8 o'clock mark and contribute your own insights and questions. Also, we invite you to consider becoming a member of the Churchll+Club. We're 7,500 members strong, and to support and fully participate in the exceptional discussions that we convene on a regular basis. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag Churchll+Club, and you should find other Twitter codes in your programs. So let's kick off our discussion. Please give a warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks to the Churchll+Club. Thanks also to our hosts here at PARC. This is obviously a historic location for innovation. And like all good innovations, it usually happens in the basement, which is where we are. And the panelists are all actually at the lowest point in the room. So you should expect a lot of innovation out of this panel. No, seriously, this is a terrifically exciting topic, not only because it just intrinsically is, but because research will show that this is actually an area that is increasing in its importance. In 2009, the United Nations announced that more people live in cities globally than live in rural areas. It was a significant change in human history, as it turns out. Our own research at the McKinsey Global Institute shows that by 2025, the top 600 cities in the world will drive 60% of GDP growth, despite only having 25% of the population. So, when people are in cities, they're actually more productive. And of course, there's a tremendous undercurrent behind that too, because it won't be the same 600 cities in 2025 that are the same 600 cities now. There's a marked shift east, there's a marked shift south in terms of what those cities are. We also found that it's not just the mega cities, the cities that have over 10 million in population, which matter, but actually those cities between 150,000 to 10 million, which actually would drive a tremendous amount of economic growth. But again, this doesn't come just automatically. It just doesn't come for free because people move to cities. There's hard work to be done. You know, when we analyze India, for instance, just to sustain the amount of urbanization that will occur there, they'll require over $1 trillion in CapEx in order to put infrastructure in place. So there are tremendous challenges. Of course, technology is a way to address some of those challenges, and that intersection between urbanization and cities and technology is what we want to talk about today. We have a tremendous panel here that we're honored to be joined by, you know, as Karen introduced. And so why don't we just start, go down the line here. For each of you, why don't you tell us what you do? Could be your day job, it could be you know, public service, and then how you came, you know, to this place about, you know, thinking about cities and how technology intersects with them. Katharine, let's start with you.
Sure. So I'm Katharine Frase. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for IBM Public Sector, which is one of those titles where you go, oh yeah, and what does that mean? So I view myself as sort of the translator between the research and development teams across IBM and both our sales teams and our clients in cities, government, education, and healthcare. So how do you take technology speak and turn it into something that looks or sounds valuable to the business leader, and vice versa? How do you take a business problem and convert it into something that the technologist can work on? In terms of smarter cities, I came to it, I think, really out of work that we were doing at that point in the research division around the notion of smarter planet that you see on, you know, posters as you go through the airport, but a notion that the same techniques that we use to work on kind of the cyber infrastructure in the back offices of businesses could be applied to physical systems in the real world, right? And since cities are a microcosm of that, you know, pick any topic you'd like, whether it's healthcare or education or social service or water or energy or traffic or public safety, right? All of those exist in a city, and it's a system of systems problem. And that sounded like just so difficult that IBM Research should work on it, so we did.
Very good. David.
Thank you. Yes, I'm David Gann. I'm a professor in Innovation and Technology Management at Imperial College. I wonder how many people know where and what Imperial College is. So if you do follow universities, you'll have seen that the QS World Rankings of Universities pitched us as #2 in the world 2 weeks ago. And we're a science and engineering. That wasn't a pitch other than just a statement of a ranking, Karen.
You get a nonprofit exemption, it's okay.
We're a science and engineering university, and I'm over here actually with a team meeting some of our alumni and some of our corporate collaborators, including PARC, and I know some of you are in the room, our alumni. So I'm Vice President at Imperial, and I'm responsible for building out and developing a 25-acre innovation district in London. I've been involved in working on cities and innovation in cities for some time, and my other role is chairing a board for the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. If we get to the end of the evening, I can tell you a little bit about Boris, but that's another story.
We should go there.
And the board, actually it's an exciting situation because we had the Olympics in 2012, and you know, it surprised the British sort of spirit that we actually got through the Olympics without any disasters. and any of you who came may have found it didn't even rain through those 2 weeks, and it was a pleasant experience.
Well done. How did you do that?
So we realised actually that London was working quite well, except that London's growing. It's the only European city that's growing at a pace, over 100,000 population growth a year. 5th of January, I'm told, it's going to be bigger than ever before. 1939, it was 8.6 million in Greater London. And it's going to beat New York to being a 9 million population city. And London's a great city to be in, but how are we going to accommodate people and all the activities and businesses that we need and let it grow? You know, it's a very international city, 300 languages spoken every day. It has more graduates per capita than any other city of its size. So the market for technology is interesting, and I'll say something later on about e-commerce and online shopping and what that's doing to the city. So those are some of the sort of constituents that we're working with and ingredients. And the question that we're looking at, and we'll talk about a bit from the London experience, is how do we enable good things to happen using digital technologies that aren't embedded in the current infrastructure? And that's the project we're working on.
Great. Thank you. Jay.
Hello, Jay Mezher. I'm the Director of Virtual Design and Construction. I work for Parsons Brinckerhoff, an infrastructure engineering firm. What I usually work on is building information technologies and enable the company to design projects in 3D and using multidimensional models rather than 2D. So the traditional design process, you design using paper, plan, section, elevation. New technologies enable you to design a project in 3D, and then you coordinate it, find conflicts, validate schedules before you build it. These technologies are moving too fast, and they're changing the way projects are being designed and delivered. So a lot of infrastructure jobs right now are being delivered in alternative delivery methods, like design build, where you combine contractor and designer in the same entity delivering a job for the client, or even public-private partnership. So when you have multiple stakeholders, it's a designer, contractor, and then the financier and the client, you need these technologies to have everyone looking at the same piece of information. And then not only that, but any conflicts, any risks that you can mitigate up front, then you're saving potentially a lot of money. Digital cities, how I came about this is I was working on the Alaskan Way Viaduct project in Seattle over 10 years ago. And then it's an infrastructure job that spans the entire city. It's a damaged viaduct that they wanted to replace. And they looked at options, whether it's going to be a cut and cover tunnel, surface option, or an elevated option. They even looked at more than 90 different options on how to replace it. Now, that said, when the project was being designed, we were building 3D models of all these different options. We wanted to see how it fits within the context. So we started building the context around it, and it evolved into a mega 3D model of the entire city. Now, that was the first use of it.
Scope creep, maybe?
Scope creep, yeah, it could be a byproduct of it. Now, that said, we started noticing that I have this virtual model of the city. Well, I can use it for view impact studies. I can support my environmental impact statement with before and after scenarios. I can run wind analysis, computational fluid dynamics. I can do lighting, shadow studies, etc. So you end up with multiple uses from the same database. And now with the explosion of all this information, whether it's GIS or social media or traffic, we're thinking of better ways to integrate this model and look at growth patterns. What is the impact of sustainability, carbon emissions? Is the city going to grow in a compact scenario, or is it going to be spread? And then basically look at options, validate, simulate them before you make a decision to get the best out of it.
Great, thanks. Mike, how did you come to this topic?
So I'm Mike Steep. I run global business operations at PARC. My interest is in figuring out a way to take emerging technologies and accelerating innovation, make it practical, and to improve the quality of people's lives. So it sounds like a high and mighty thing to do, but it started with a conversation that I had in China about 8 years ago. I was at Microsoft at the time, and a technical fellow and I had visited China, and we got into a really bizarre conversation with a professor and also a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences who was talking about the pollution levels in China, especially in Beijing. He was really concerned at that time, this is a while ago, about the Mongolian dust and the pollution creating health hazards for his grandchildren. And so we started talking about how technology, emerging technology in particular, could be used to address that problem and perhaps have an impact on people's lives. And part of it involved convergence of hardware and software, but to make a long story short, it triggered an interest to understand how do you take emerging technology and make it possible for that to improve the overall quality of urban life, especially given the data that you just talked about, the tremendous growth in population in cities, and now with over 51% of people now urbanized, and solve some of the basic issues. And so that's my area of interest with digital cities. And I work with David and others with cities like the City of London to kind of take a look at those issues.
Great.
So, okay.
Thank you. You mentioned, you made reference to getting practical. So, David, London actually has problems, right? And you'd mentioned before when we were talking about some of those maybe being around peak loading, around infrastructure. How are you thinking about that in London with regard to some of these problems, and how does technology, how is that involved in addressing them?
I think it's probably quite useful to focus on practical applications when you're talking about smart anything, because it's one of those euphemistic words that bounces all over the place. And it's, in fact, if you look on Google, you'll find that there are three most hated buzzwords in marketing. Smart is the most hated.
What are the other two?
Sustainability and stakeholder. So I actually wanted to not call the board the Smart London Board, but our good friends in IBM and elsewhere had done so much work marketing the concept, and I don't blame you for that. I was involved in some of the conversations earlier, that it had stuck. So we're the Smart London Board, but we wanted to try and think about a practical outcome that would be meaningful for the city authority and for citizens. And peak loading or congestion is one of the key focal points, and you and I and everyone knows what that feels like if you're sitting in a traffic jam. But you see peak loading in almost every form of infrastructure and activity in densely packed cities. If you're at a ball game and you come out and try and get on the mobile and everyone else is on the network, you can't make a phone call. And so it goes on, and it gets really serious if you've got peak loading and you can't get into a hospital and you're sick. And so we wanted to try and understand these issues and then deploy technology in a sensible way to deal with that. And I'll give you one example that we're deploying right now, which is contactless payment systems for our transport infrastructure across London, multimodal. And we need some evidence. What is the issue we're trying to deal with? And if you visit London, you'll have exchanged your dollars for pounds. And if you go on our transport infrastructure, you'll exchange your pounds for a ticket. It's a different currency exchange. If you're the rail and network operator, ticketing customers like you and I is 10% of the cost of operations, right? So it's a non-value adding exchange of currency in the city. And if you go in a busy period, you're standing in line waiting to get your ticket, which is part of the friction of being a citizen in a city. So, the simple fact that we're exchanging currency for a ticket is causing a loss of efficiency, higher prices, and friction points in trying to get on and off the rail and other transport, multimodal transport network. So we decided to move to NFC, Near Field Communication platform, across all of London's transport infrastructure. And if you come in January, you'll be able to go and you'll be able to load up your mobile device or your smart payment card and just walk on and off. And we're going to get that friction right out of the infrastructure.
You're going to take Apple Pay or not?
We'll take, actually, we have another program on digital money, and we're looking at cryptocurrencies and so on. I mean, London is still the financial centre of the world, and the financial institutions need to get real on where virtual payments are going, and I'm sure we'll take Apple Pay. I mean, I'm sure we'll take very, very many others as well.
So is this different than an Oyster card, or is it?
The Oyster card is gone. It's pretty well going. Yeah, forget the Oyster card.
All right.
Yeah.
How is this better?
Well, if you get an Oyster card at the moment, you have to charge it, and you have to stand at a charge point to do that, and you have to dab it down. You won't have to dab anything down through a gate when you go through with the new system. You just have your device in your pocket and walk on and off, and you load up the points on your device.
Got it. So I don't even have to...
No, forget that. Why would you need to?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Katharine, let's talk about automation a little bit.
Okay.
Clearly, in IBM research, there's a lot of work going on in automating various things. Is that a set of technologies which is relevant in cities?
It's a big question. I'm not sure whether I would go the automation route as much as I would go towards kind of making information visible right? So we're going to have a lot of conversation, I think, about new innovations that make it possible to put better instrumentation throughout a city, get more information, do nifty things, right? But there's also a lot of information already in cities that cities don't always take the best advantage of. Some of it's in paper and it's sitting in the file cabinets and nobody's looked at it in years. Some of it's in this department, but that department could really make a better decision if they knew what was over there, right? So there's a lot of things that we're doing to try to enable cities to do better on what they've already got, whether that's the water mains that are already in the ground, or the information that's someplace in somebody's desk drawer, but because it's not visible to the people who are trying to make decisions, they don't make the best decisions. A quick example, you know, if you go to somebody in a city agency and you say, could you make a better decision if you could see some stuff from the guy, from the department next door? The answer is almost always yes. If the natural next question is, great, and will you share information with him? And the answer is almost never yes. And it's for good reasons. You don't want somebody else tampering with your data. You don't actually like that guy. You know, you're responsible for what you're responsible for. And so what you realize is that in cities, many decisions are actually based on time and space, time and location. They're not based on all the other attributes of the data. And so there's a bunch of examples we could talk about where just getting the agencies to say, okay, I'm not going to move my data, but I'm going to allow the agency next door to see the time and space elements of my data, enables you to do things like make sure that I'll take an example that perhaps does not apply in this area, but I'll take an example from Minneapolis, where wouldn't you like the fire trucks to know which roads are going to be plowed if your house caught fire, right? If you were the ones planning the permits for the Giants Parade tomorrow, wouldn't you like to be able to scan across all the agencies in the city of San Francisco and make sure that there are no road repairs being planned? Or there are no block parties that already had a permit for tomorrow afternoon because it is, after all, Halloween, right? It's those practical things, right? And it sounds very kind of dull in some ways, but there's some nifty computer science in it to be able to do it. And more importantly, it's about getting humans to want to actually collaborate for a smarter city. And sometimes it's the humans that are the hard part, it's not so much the data.
How do you solve the human part?
So the human part, our experience is you start with a leader who's interested in, has enough of a real pain point that he's willing to try to do something a different way than before.
Or she.
Or she. Yeah, she is good. And so what we find is that once you've done a pilot project that's very focused, right? I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to get these two agencies to work together, right? Once it works, now it was everybody's idea, and everybody wants in. And the thing kind of takes off on its own.
It's funny, right? I mean, all the technology has the potential for enabling all these things, and oftentimes the hard stuff is the people stuff, right?
Right. No, if it doesn't fit into what people actually want to do every day, it'll sit on the shelf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jay, you've mentioned before, we've talked about the key role that infrastructure plays in cities, and you've said before, infrastructure design has tremendous implications for how cities grow. You've even talked a little bit about what that means in Seattle. What does technology have to do with that? How does it?
I think I agree with Katharine. It all boils down to decision making. I mean, how do you decide that this is the best project for a city? Whether it's a tunnel, bridge, or any other infrastructure job, transit-oriented development. It definitely impacts everybody's lives, from businesses, mobility, environment, air noise quality, lighting conditions, etc. How do you decide that this is the best solution? Technology now enables you, in three phases. One is you're mapping out existing conditions in an accurate way. Like I go back to that example in Seattle, we modeled the entire city above ground, and then we modeled the underground utilities also. And that enabled the design team and everyone on the project to know exactly where the conflicts are and where the pinch points. So rather than look at one option and say, this is our project, that's what we're going to do, they looked at more than 90 different options. And those models enabled them to evaluate performance on these models, not only from a visual standpoint, but from a performance standpoint. I can compare the schedules. I can look at the risks associated with this job. I can link it to my cost. And then traffic analysis. So basically you pick those 5 criteria or 10, whatever they are, on what is my best solution. Does it have the least travel time? Is it the least impact? Is it context sensitive? Does it impact the businesses and how it's going to change and transform the city? So again, it goes back to, rather than I have one option that I design, I'm looking at 5 or 10 different options. And now it's even going to get better with cloud computing, because you're going to look at 100 options and then get all this information, analyze it, and then say, this is the best solution for me. I mean, interestingly enough, on those 2 jobs, what I noticed is, I worked on Alaskan Way and the floating bridge that connects Seattle to Bellevue. It took them more than 10 years for the planning phase and the design, because they looked at so many different options. Now they're going to build them in 5. So it's no longer time to build the project. It's time to plan it properly, look at every single scenario, visualize it, build it virtually, find all the conflicts, pick the best solution, and then the construction part is the easy part, because all the companies know how to do it according to standards and code. But how do you make the best decision, for whatever you want to do? And I think those are the tools that are enabling better decisions.
Although I wonder if that's optimal too, that it's twice as long to actually plan, design, and permit the thing.
I mean, 520 is since the mid-90s. It's even more than 10 years. Alaskan Way took 10 years planning and design phase, 30%. Now in 5 years they're building it. So.
You must know more about Seattle than anybody else in the world.
Probably, yeah. I mean,
Is there anything that would surprise us about Seattle that you know? As
coffee, maybe.
Not a surprise, right? Yeah, there must be some underground stuff. Mike, some of this stuff that's going on here at PARC is partly digital, but you've mentioned that it also involves, the physical world and materials.
Yeah,
how
that's
does
a
that
really,
affect cities?
really important point. So we need to kind of adjust our thinking a bit about what a city looks like. And so instead of thinking of it as buildings and infrastructure from that perspective that we can touch and feel, think of it in terms of data layers, where underground, deep underground, we have sensors and information more or less to talk to us about issues around water and supplies to the city. And at the subterranean level, you also have transportation, subways and trains. Then you have the utility piece of that, and then you have the surface level. Now, what's interesting about the surface level is that's actually changing rather rapidly because of the deployment of technology in cars. So in talking to a number of different companies about this, we will have 4G Wi-Fi capability very shortly in cars. What people don't understand is that it'll extend the range so that when you have millions of cars on the road, it'll be possible someday at least to understand how traffic is developing, where there are jams, where there are problems as this comes up into the cloud. And then you have the airspace layer, which are the buildings, heat, for example, and carbon footprint. Now, the way things are today, everything is sort of a potpourri of patchwork quilts, each being independently developed. So you have the car companies working on solutions around, protection in the car and how to, anything from that to what Google's working on, the autonomous car. So you have everybody working on different pieces of it, but I think the interesting point will be the convergence piece. That is when the technology layers start to intersect each other and we begin to see a completely different view of the city from a data perspective. So we understand how the city is actually functioning, and we become, from our smartphone and from our car, a node in the city, and that's going to have huge ramifications in terms of the quality of our life. And it's not that far off. What's very interesting about this is the technology is exploding in each of these different conduits. What really needs to happen next is the convergence piece, the intersection piece of that, where you can understand the data to really determine what is happening to a city. It's almost like you're creating a real live, smart city, literally, from all the data layers. So PARC and others are very much involved in the emerging technology piece of this and trying to figure out how does this go out into the real world where those intersecting points can happen, convergence can happen. And I think convergence is really the key.
David, what are you?
Well, I was going to mention I agree with Mike entirely about the data, and it's another infrastructure for cities, and in a way, the Internet of Things is just starting to be understood and to happen, and we're awash with data. I mean, I think London has more CCTV and other data points that could be used for these things, and we've tried to some degree of success to make data publicly available where we can, and for 2 or 3 years we've had the London Data Store, and we relaunched that last week, and that provides a dashboard for how parts of the city are performing. And
Could you say more about that? Is not a place I go in and buy things about London.
No, it's not, but
souvenirs.
There are 2 or 3 things here. One is giving transparency to Londoners and London's businesses and London's visitors about what the city is like, which gives more public engagement when decisions are being made for planning, and it gives you more evidence base for what might need to be fixed and where good things are happening.
It's an open data portal.
It's an open data portal. We have the Open Data Institute, which was set up by Tim Berners-Lee, actually, in London, and that's part of the Smart London programme. And this portal will provide you can look online right now if you've got a device that's logged in, to how the city's working. It goes everything from smoking quit rates per month or per week through to environmental conditions across different parts of the city and energy use and so on. And some of this data is quite liberating. So 2.5 years ago, we made quite a lot of transport data available. And since then, 450 apps or more have been built by independent businesses out in London. Some of those are on my device, and I use them. They mesh data from elsewhere. And so you see jobs and growth coming on the back of how the city's operating. And I think, Karen, the Churchll+Club was saying there's an interest here in how technology and the economy work. And actually, we could give some real examples now in the last 2.5 years of how having some open data has enabled new businesses to take off that are quite helpful also for citizens and people who live in London
Please
to
do.
make their way around.
Yeah.
So, I think those are some of the things that can be done once we get the data infrastructure in the way Mike was talking about it.
What are some of those examples?
In terms of the data, I mean, multimodal transport data that help you navigate your journey through the city, rather than just have to look up the times of when something will arrive. And we found something curious about that, actually, because we started to give better evidence about whether a train or a bus or whatever will be at a platform when you can be there, so you can plan your journey time. And we found that people didn't want just the statement of data. They actually wanted a pictogram to see the train on their device coming towards the station. It gave them more confidence that the data was real. And so, there's some interesting sort of sociological stuff to understand about the presentation and visualization of this data. And that isn't going to come from the mayor's office. I mean, Boris, may be quite brilliant, but he's not going to work all of this out. What one wants to do is put this data out there and let people on the street or in the universities figure out good ways of using it. And if it works, sell it or share it, and we'll use it. And that's just really taking off in London at the moment.
And Tim or I called it government as platform, right?
Right.
Yeah, to be able to use it that way. Yeah. Jay, I think you probably have some experience here in trying to make data more consumable, right? I mean, we're awash in all of this data, but how can you actually make a better decision with that? Yeah.
In a way, yes. Usually, 3D models and visual models tend to simplify complex ideas and display them in a way that everyone can understand them. If you hand off, a set of drawings and a, 5,000 activity schedule to someone that's not familiar with engineering or architecture, then they're probably going to fumble with it, or they're going to miss some of the details. They're probably not going to understand it. But if you give them a 3D model or a 4D model that's connected to the schedule that shows how the project's being built and all the traffic access all the site logistics, everything, then you're distilling all this complex information into one piece of, geometry or imagery. And now it's even getting better because you have mobile devices that are pulling information from different data sets. So rather than combine it all on one model that's not handled, that can't be handled by a computer, you're pulling, let's say, GIS information, traffic information, design information from different databases housed in different places, running it on the cloud, and then everybody has access to it with layers and information that you can understand quickly and then get the message
Have you
across.
seen decision makers make a better or a different decision based on being able to see things in a way that was more real, more easily digestible?
Absolutely. We do it all the time with our infrastructure design because the environmental impact process requires you to look at more than one option, at least 3 options, and then putting them all together in a model-based form. You make sure that everyone's looking at the same thing, making collaborative decisions, and then definitely.
Can I just butt in on an example of the cost of not doing this?
Yeah.
Because we went after this in the Smart London board to find out, where would these sort of models be useful, and we looked at the issue of utilities digging the street up multiple times, because the gas company doesn't talk to the water company, doesn't talk to the fiber company, and they're doing a repair or they're putting a new piece of infrastructure under the street. And we asked them why they do this, and they say because we don't have any way of knowing when other people are going to work there and what's under there. So we said, and there was no digital model of this, so there was no single place to go to find out. And we asked the transport authorities to estimate through some cases of how much it cost Londoners to have traffic congestion because roads were being opened up multiple times, and it's about $1.5 billion a year of unnecessary congestion and wasted time.
Dollars or pounds?
Dollars.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's about £1 billion, right?
Okay.
And I can do those sort of currency conversions,
That was pretty
even with jet lag. So there's an absolute cost because the data isn't assembled into a model in a visible way that's usable by those who could get together and coordinate and use it. And Parsons Brinckerhoff happened to be another member of the Smart London board and have some fantastic tools for getting into this. And we really want to learn from Seattle, actually, on how to do this
Well,
stuff.
and there's a practical cost as well. There's a cost to the city of ripping the road up so many times, right? And so there's a cost to the citizens. There's a reduction in quality of life. There's a frustration with their political leaders because, for goodness sakes, how hard can this be? Why do you have to rip up my road 4 times, right? So by doing this, you create value in 4 different dimensions in different parts of the city. I just wanted to build on the visualization point for a second, because I think, at the end of the day, we love to talk about infrastructure, right? But at the end of the day, a city is about the humans that live in it, and the city, and the people that work in it, and the people who work for the city government. We sometimes forget about them, but they're in the city too. And this notion of how do we turn all of this data into actionable insight for the humans, right? Whether it's each of us as citizens or in some other way, it is increasingly about how do we visually display it. Because if you think about how we all deal with complexity every day, there are people who can in fact have 2 different cell phone conversations going at the same time. I am not one of them. I have no ability to resolve auditory confusion. It's not. But we all resolve complicated things visually all the time, right? It's how we're programmed as humans to deal with complexity. And so this notion of how do we take complicated things and visually present the information to make it easier for the human to do something, and it won't be the same for every human. It's different for your engineers than it is for, the guy doing dispatch on the water repair trucks, right? But that notion of what does it have to look like for us to be confident the train data is real, right? It's a really important piece of this.
Do you have examples where that has made a difference?
I think I'll do it the way David did. I have lots of examples where if you don't do it, the technology sits on the shelf, right? So there are probably still people kicking around in all of our technical organizations that think that a green screen or a spreadsheet are great user interfaces, right? But the rest of us don't, right? And so if you actually want somebody to do something, you have to get this presentation layer right.
Yeah. And usually the way it happens also is that once you share this information in a really simplified and easy manner, everybody will provide you meaningful input. Like if you give everyone a set of drawings that they don't understand, they're probably not going to give you any input. But once you give it to them in an app or a model that they could click and understand the ins and outs, you'll get really meaningful input. We worked on an exercise with the Urban Land Institute where they brought in 250 people from the Puget Sound area up in Seattle, and they said, here are some Legos. Where do you think urban growth should happen? And do you think it should happen in a dispersed manner, compact or mid-compact? And then each group decided this is what the best thing is going to do. But what we did is we modeled it and then generated the carbon emissions from each option, packaged it in one real-time model where you can click in, and then a slider shows you state targets versus what your option will give you. Immediately, everyone got it. It's like, no, this is the best solution. Compact solution is going to reduce carbon emissions, is going to meet state goals. And then they had this tool that they could even explain it. So the more you simplify it, the more input you're going to get, and the better decisions you're going to end up with.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, and I think some of this is of very serious importance to certain users of cities. I mean, if you have a respiratory illness and you are in a city that has certain levels of air pollution, and you compound that by using an underground system where air quality is low.
Like Beijing?
Like Beijing, like London. London has in some parts of London, it's the lowest quality air in any city in Europe, any major city in Europe. And you're putting yourself at risk of an episode, but you don't actually see visibly the air quality as you're walking in and out of an underground station. But we can signpost that digitally and visually on a device. And we're starting to do that now and make available information for people who may be at risk, and there are many other categories of that, or people who may find it difficult to move around and can't use the stairways or what have you. And I think so visual signposting and other forms of signposting so you can navigate your personal journey through what you want to do in a city based on the sort of models and data is a massive opportunity space that will make densely packed cities more livable and enjoyable and take the cost out. I mean, once you've had an episode and you have to go down and have the emergency services find someone down in the underground and shut the train down, all the costs knock on to the health service and to the operator of the rail infrastructure. And we are trying to get rid of that, or at least remove some of those problems by making data available.
Yeah. Although I'm trying to figure out how this works. If you have asthma, don't enter the tube now?
Well, actually, there's another thing we haven't mentioned yet, which is predictability. Now, it's a very dangerous word to use at the moment because in complex data, making predictions is hard, but the more data we have, the better the models are, the more we can move towards giving people some sort of notice that the next day we might move within the danger points in terms of enough of the indicators to suggest find a different way to get to work than your normal route because you might be at risk. So we're, at Imperial, we're doing a lot of, we have a big data science institute where we do a lot of work on the medical side, and we're looking for more predictability, including in things like disease spread through different populations. And, we want to be able to control that in densely packed cities. And there's some obvious examples, by the way. So, some of this stuff is going to happen, and it's not going to happen overnight because of some serious work, and it won't be done by one institution. I think the sort of organizations sitting here and in the participants are going to have to come together and work hard on this.
Mike, where are you?
I was just thinking about all this. one of the things that we're not even addressing is who's going to be at the center of all this in terms of trying to figure out how to deal with it. Because I think the technology explosion is real across all these different patchwork quilts, and someday there will be convergence occurring. So who's going to drive it? I doubt it's going to be the government alone. I think we're going to see a situation where the citizen is going to have to take on the responsibility to put themselves at the center of all this to figure out how actually to manage it. Sort of the iPhone example, well, in privacy. You don't have the government head on that one trying to figure out how to protect privacy. It's the commercial interests that have actually created the debate, along with a few other convenient opportunities from the NSA. But yeah, with the kind of things that we're talking about, it's going to be rather difficult for us to escape the reality that we're in devices and things that are parts of nodes of a bigger network, and we're going to have to actually figure out what to do with the data.
How are we going to think about privacy or privacy, as some may call it?
Yeah, there's no we, really. I mean, if you look at the demographics, there's a huge difference in attitudes toward privacy at a break point of around 30 years of age, right? So, you know, privacy to someone who is growing up these days, the future generation, is very different meaning than those who are of the older generation who've had some sense of it before the technology has changed everything. I think it's going to become even more so. So I hate to say this, but I think that the commercial interests are going to be the ones that are going to actually drive most of the policies, not the government interests. So the citizenry should have a role here because it's going to impact quality of life. The question is, how will we take that on?
How does the citizenry affect that?
I suppose if you get benign benefit from all this, just like with the iPhone, posting your information or making it available, it won't become an issue. The issue is if you have something else that develops, like, for example, a security incident or other things that really are disturbing. So I don't know what the implications of all this are at the current stage, but it's interesting, and it's you know, something that I think we're not going to have much control over. It's just going to have to evolve. I think we're underestimating what's going to happen in the next 50 years.
Yeah. Privacy, cybersecurity, a big deal.
I think
in a connected city?
I think it's a big deal. I mean, I worry about things like failure mode because, you know, we're working so hard to try and make good things happen, which is, and it's really difficult to integrate some of this data or to connect previously disconnected systems. I mean, take transport and the electricity network. Electric vehicles actually cut across both. You've got to have charge points and draw your electricity, and you've got to know where the travel patterns are. And you know, when you start connecting these and having integration, you're actually putting two systems potentially at risk of attack. And it depends then how you organize the layers and the systems management. But we don't necessarily do the model. We model what we're trying to achieve. We don't necessarily model the failure modes of these systems. And that probably is a worry for city authorities, and I hope it is.
Seems like an important lesson. Hey, Katharine, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with David. I think you know, one of the ways to think about it is we're coming from a world in which we had cyber infrastructures, right, computer systems of various kinds, and physical systems of many kinds. And the more that the physical becomes cyber, right, now you've got both kinds of security issues combined, right? And so it is an enormous area of research. And so just this, but it's also the same notions that you might use, you know, on the layers of firewalls and stuff that you do to protect your electronic information inside a company, right, are also the kind of techniques you're going to have to start using to protect the cyber half of your transport or your electric grid or your other pieces. So I do think it's a little bit of a cautionary tale, but I don't think any of us would give up on the promise of a smart grid because of the fear of the security issues, right? But it's a piece of the technology we got to work on.
Yeah, I got to tell you, for my sins, I was once a municipal CIO, and I visited a water treatment plant. I never felt more nervous than I was next to a huge tank of pure chlorine. I was like, okay, I'm ready to leave the room now. Let's go to something happier, though. Katharine, you mentioned before this idea that, look, it's the people within cities that actually make cities. How can this technology enhance civic engagement? How can it enhance the way that we interact with each other in such a way that we actually improve our cities?
So I think there are a number of examples like that, and some of it, I think the citizen engagement thing is really important. And it really comes down to, we can have all the data in the world, right? But how do we get citizens to actually care? So you think about, doctors will tell you that for all of our health care, what matters most to our health is that we care about our health, that we actually do what they told us to do, or we stay on our diets, or we wear our Fitbits, or whatever it is, right? The same is true in a city, right? That the citizen has to care. You can give them all the information about their water usage, or their electric usage, or their personal carbon footprint, or, make it up, right? But unless they care to do something with the information, you won't, as a population, be moving in the direction that you want. So some really interesting experiments going on, and Mike may want to comment on some of these too, on this notion of how do you portray the information in a way that gets people engaged, right? So we've been, and since humans are a little quirky, you may have noticed this, and they don't follow the laws of math and physics very well. The question is, how do you add things to engage them? So you roll out smart water meters and you show everybody the data. Great. You'll find that there's a section of people who, once they see that water is flowing at 2 o'clock in the morning, assuming they do not have teenage sons, they must have a leak, and there's a group of people who will fix it right away. And a lot of people won't. Then you tell them, well, I'm going to price to you based on your water usage. Well, that gets another set of the population to wake up, right? But a lot of people won't. On their list of priorities, their water bill is not what worries them. But then if you start layering on, suppose I gave you points for good behavior. Suppose I show you your data compared to everybody else in the neighborhood. Suppose I let the Giants fans compete against the A's fans on water usage, right? What you start seeing is higher levels of engagement of individuals. And the more engaged the person is, the more they actually conserve water and the more money they save. And so it becomes a virtuous cycle, right? So there's a lot of experimentation, I think, yet to be done on how do we get people to care so that on average we're moving in a better direction. The other version of that, and then I'll stop, the other version of that is how can a city use technology to better engage with its citizens, right? So there's some public project being considered, right? What is today's methodology? Today's methodology is a town hall in some high school auditorium, and only the people who have an axe to grind show up, and they queue up for the microphone, and as many of them as fit in the hour get to speak, and that's all the city government knows about what the community actually thinks, right? Citizens aren't happy, the city's not listening, the city knows they have a blind spot, but they don't know where it is, right? We all have carrying around in our pockets technology that could fix that.
Have you seen any cities fix it that way?
We have, actually. There are some small cities in Canada that are starting to do exactly this, to truly try to enable a much broader sense of how is the population actually thinking about what to do next on their waterfront or whatever. And how do you reach populations that don't have smartphones in their pockets, right? How do you be inclusive?
Yeah. So. Mike, were there other things that you wanted to add in terms of civic engagement?
Yeah, in terms of some company models, so one of the larger telcos is considering the whole notion of allowing people to manage their own data on their cell phones to monetize it. So they're trying to look for ways to have the user more or less determine how to manage privacy, and at the same time also figure out how it's going to be monetized. Really wild and crazy. There was a conversation with a major city authority about figuring out how to transfer heat from the underground tunnels that the subway was producing into the buildings to reduce carbon footprint, and then giving everybody credits for taking different times of the day that they want to commute in. So you'd actually change your schedule and get a credit, a carbon footprint credit, delivered to your phone that could be redeemed for money.
So incentives plus transparency can drive
the
behavior.
thermostat approach. In other words, they're using commuters as thermostats, so to speak,
Yeah.
in the model. But the objective was to reduce carbon footprint by taking the heat from the tunnels and putting it into the buildings. So there's some really creative ideas out there in terms of trying to figure out ways to monetize and incentivize people to adopt the technology and use it to their own advantage. And I think we'll see more of that.
Terrific. We'll come to questions in just a moment.
Well, I mean, I was fortunate enough to visit Airbnb this week in
An Airbnb place or Airbnb?
Airbnb, the headquarters.
The headquarters,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And
Did you have to sign up? Or?
What a wonderful idea and activity, because, you know, we're living in denser and denser cities, but we have some resources that are not well utilized. And, you know, you can come past some parts of London and the lights never go on in the housing because they're an asset class bought by someone in Qatar or Hong Kong or wherever. And the ability to free up and make better use in the sharing economy, and, you know, there's new social enterprises coming into this, will probably make cities, they sort of lubricate the assets of a city. And government doesn't need to be involved in some of these things. You do need to have the right regulatory structure to allow people to operate, and I think that's probably one of the things that needs to be worked through on those sort of business models. We have carpooling schemes, you have carpooling schemes. You know, a lot of that will be enabled by better data and more real-time availability of information. Uber for the taxis. Yeah. And so, you know, I'm quite hopeful actually that we can use our resources in a better way and understand them more intelligently. And that will be not just something for the city authority.
I think in San Francisco, Airbnb will now collect hotel tax just to make it more equal. But can I stay in one of those mansions, though, with Airbnb?
Why not? Why not?
All right, let's, are there questions from the audience?
Hi, Stephen Teal from Accenture. This question is for David. I'm curious, in your plan, you talked a lot about NFC communications for public transit use. What's your plan to actually get the folks who don't have the latest smartphones and NFC on their phones to be able to use that same system without friction?
Well, I think there's always going to be some lag from some people, and you will always be able to buy a ticket, certainly for the foreseeable future. And so we're not completely ripping apart the ability to change your currency for a piece of paper that gives you the right to travel. I think the initial plan is that more people are going to be moving to the contactless payment mechanism over the next few months and years, which will actually make it easier to buy a ticket if you haven't got one of the right smart devices. And, you know, it'll sort its way out. I think there's a bigger issue behind your question, which is, you know, what happens to segments of the population that are not digitally enabled for whatever reason. And London has a program on that. It has all sorts of support infrastructures that go into the boroughs that are trying to help people be part of the digital economy. And that's one of the data points. If you go on the data store, you know, what are the participation rates? And we care about that. And, you know, it's something that we will put resources into in London to try and enable people. Because, you know, that transparency and engagement and ability to use a city digitally and physically is going to be very important.
Other questions, please?
Yes, I'm Stephen Donaldson. I just wanted to, I think this is a fantastic discussion. I think big data is an enormous part of this. There's one platform in the United States called Peak Democracy that I think cities are using, and there's some other ones that allow for increased citizen input and more real time with questions and policy making. And I know, Jay, you mentioned that model with the Legos where you get, when you give people the alternatives and a real choice and you take it outside the city hall meeting, you get different kinds of input from the citizenry. And I think that's the whole issue of policy-driven decision-making with cities. I'd love you guys to comment on this because I think that's the key to this, whether it's here or in the UK.
Any thoughts?
I think it's the experience we have. We're building out Crossrail at the moment, and you know, that's Europe's largest civil construction project. And it will open up transport east and west in a new way. But the planning of that, and this is really in Jay's area, has taken years and years and years. And it's taken that long in London because of the, in my view, quite right, democratic processes that we go through about who will be affected and who will benefit. And we're in the middle of this with a thing called High Speed 2, and we're in Crossrail 2. And the planning phases and the consultation phases and the engagement phases are the longer part. We have to accelerate those, but we have to have the means of putting evidence in to the room for anyone who has a say on this to participate in it. And I think actually we ought to be able to do more of that because we're collecting better evidence on how our cities are performing and how we use them. And that should give us, I hope, better decision making and allow people to come out with the right infrastructure in years to come.
I mean, despite Katharine's comment about public meetings, the online commenting I think is extremely powerful, but we don't completely understand how to deal with it as a democracy, right? So people are probably familiar with the old when Jon Stewart said, "Please, everybody go crash the net neutrality comment site," right? Go, my pretties, right? A buddy of mine is actually the CIO of the FCC, and he had to deal with that on the other end. On the other hand, it was a tremendous expression of grassroots democracy.
Mike, can I just add a point on this? Because chairing the Smart London Board, one of the members is part of one of these open communities. And we were discussing how to engage with various parts of the community. And he was tweeting from the board meeting and coming back with insights and information from a much wider constituency. And I didn't know as chairman of the Smart London Board whether that was fair to the other board members or not. I mean, it opens up a completely different way of thinking about how you run a meeting. If one or two members are consulting with who knows how many people about what decisions might be discussed in a meeting like that. And I think we're figuring it out as we go along, actually.
And there are rules in many legislatures, too, about what type of connectivity you can have on the floor, et cetera. By the way, it should be John Oliver, not Jon Stewart. All right, next question.
Yes, right here.
Yeah, sure. Stephen Mackay with Cisco, and thanks very much for your thoughts. The one area that I thought we would like to learn more about, certainly I would like to hear more about, is financing. So clearly a lot of cities are going down this smart city path. Lots of technologies involved, and there are a lot of budgetary constraints. So I'd like to hear your thoughts in terms of alternative financing methods. And for yourself, David, from my old former city, I'd like to hear how you're going about this in London.
Do you want to start? And then I'll...
I could start. I mean, we've just coming through a consultation on London's infrastructure plan 2050, inspired by Boris Johnson, the mayor, who said that if we're going to keep this city up there in the top tier, we better have an infrastructure that's going to work in years to come. How much is it going to cost? And we've actually had your colleagues from McKinsey doing part of the work for us at the moment. And we've come out with a price tag of £1.3 trillion to be invested in infrastructure. So the good news, in terms of answering part of your question, is that we've asked ourselves the question, how much do we need to invest to keep London operating in a convivial manner? The bad news is it's a scary number. And, part of that's going to have to come from tax. Part of it's going to have to come from novel financing methods. And we're going to have to figure that out. And if we don't, it's one of those horrible graphs that goes down faster because you can't stand still in a city that's growing at the rate that London is with old creaking infrastructure as part of it. So, we've got to figure out the finance model, I think.
Yeah, I think the only other comment I would add is that one of the things that we've started to do is similar to other things that have been discussed, is this question of which is the right place to start in a city. And so, based on what other cities are doing, which project should a particular city start with? Well, it depends on, which piece of the creaking infrastructure is creaking the loudest. It may also depend what data they have to inform what they want to do. But in many cases, then what happens is if you can find a somewhat easier project, that can save you money on the operational side, then two things happen. One is you freed up a little ongoing budget to apply to some investment. But the second is, even if you had to go and look for financing for that second project, now you're doing it based on successful value return from the first. So you're not being totally imaginative, right? You can say, okay, so this one worked, so here's the next piece. And we see many cities going about it in that manner, that they have a roadmap, but they're going to show value on the first step of the roadmap in order to justify the next one.
Interest rates are good right now. Please.
Hi, Shane Patrick Connolly with City of San Jose. In the discussion of data visualizations, there's a certain amount of editorial control, perhaps, that is exerted in that process. In the discussion of like the 3D modeling and choices and carbon emissions and things. How do you ensure minimization of bias in the presentation of the choices?
That's a good question.
It's a very good question. That's why we go with data-driven visualization. It's not only cartoons, and it's not based on my style or taste. It's coming from actual engineering data. So when you capture existing conditions, you're using USGS data or laser scanning to get the exact down to 1/8 of an inch information, and then with your proposed design, it's engineering grade information that you usually use to actually build the jobs. But if you build your models correctly and you geo-reference them, then your lighting conditions also that you display are accurate. And then anything that you put out there is just going to be, you'll have the confidence that it's 100% accurate. And usually nothing is shown or released without everybody's input. So one deliverable will go through 5, 10, maybe revisions, and then it gets to the point where it's ready for prime time. So I'm confident 100% that whatever is out there is just the actual real stuff. There's no way for you to put it the way you want. Especially, if you're comparing options, you're using the same viewpoint for all of them. We've had requests, for example, the new bridge is going to impact their backyard, and I'm not going to be able to see, Camino Island or the Olympics from my house. This development is going to block everything. We took actual pictures from the houses and then simulated what the impacts are going to be. So it's science, and everything is accurate. That way you don't get any bias from it.
Have you seen examples of bias?
Well, yes. There was an example of, I forget the organization, but there's a nonprofit statewide organization that does budgeting visualization. And you make choices so that they can get feedback on what type of choices you would make. But the choices are limited. There aren't choices about increasing efficiency, for example, in a certain agency to generate savings that can be used for something else. It's just very, so with physical systems, it may be simpler to avoid bias, but in other situations, it may be more challenging. I don't know.
Other questions? I think we have one over here, over there.
Andrew Grosser from FlowPro. Thanks, guys. David, I've just got a question for you. We've talked a lot about data and about quantitative analysis. I'm just fascinated by the idea of the qualitative side of things within a big city like London. Is the city taking into account the happiness levels whilst all of these?
Yeah.
While you're acquiring so much data?
First of all?
Happy hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something that, and I certainly don't want to give any impression that the city has even the capability or capacity to think its way through answers to a question like that. There are some good people working on some data in London and other cities that will be interested in that. And, in a broader sweep, I think we'll see, along with the growth of data science, the growth of behavioral economics, we'll understand a lot of other behavioral patterns because, one part of this is pattern recognition. How do we understand how we as individuals and social groups are using different spaces. One question that was asked that's on the negative of that in Crossrail is how as the operator might we understand behaviours on crowded platforms or uncrowded platforms? And there's data, you can find it publicly if you look for it, about suicide rates in London, people jumping in front of trains. Now, it's a pretty horrible thing. Of course, the poor distressed person who does it, but the train driver and any other people standing on the platform. And we're working on pattern recognition technologies that use live CCTV imaging of crowds and usage of public space to see if we can start to recognize anomalies in behaviors that we might be able to get help to people, or we might be able to see someone who might be threatening. So, you know, some of these things are bits that will be worked on for probably several or many years by researchers and others, because they're really difficult issues to deal with. Your LA Police Department has an interesting project like that, which is about crime prediction using data, and to some degree of success, where it was trialled, crime rates have been reduced by 12%. By using computer models that are generating questions about where crime might be committed and sending police to those areas at designated times rather than having people out on the beat. In ambulance services and paramedic services in London, we don't have people sitting in a station waiting to be called out. We have them out in areas of population concentration and starting to model where someone might fall down sick, so that the paramedic is closer to that area. So these are some of the issues that we want to get at and understand better that will make a difference in the end to the way in which you experience the city. And you may be happier because of it, I don't know.
Next question. Over here.
Hi, Peter Hirschberg from the City Innovate Foundation. I'm wondering if you guys might speculate a bit on how kind of citizen participation in city as a platform might develop. For example, in San Francisco, we kind of went from experimenting with open data and building apps to now, with the redevelopment of Market Street, we're turning that 2 Mile into a project next year called Market Street Prototyping, where there are going to be 50 bottom-up prototypes or projects that are almost rehearsals of the city, where actual construction is going to be done over a long weekend, and 50 projects will be tried, and then the city will learn from that. In Chicago, they're looking at how do you reimagine civics classes so that high school students working with open data can experiment with the city. And it strikes me that it's a great invitation for citizen participation, but we're at the very beginning when we just talk about participate with data. There's a way to physically kind of prototype and play with the city, and I'm just wondering where that might go, because it seems like it's something at the very beginning, still a bit top-down driven, and all of you are in positions to kind of help open that up.
Reflections?
We're using it to a certain extent, just like you were saying, to gather comments on those infrastructure jobs, but I think now it's going to the next level where it's not a website that you could go and input your comments. It's developed into apps that people can also leverage their mobile devices to input the comments that they would like to provide. Again, it goes back to the same repository, and then they're filtered, and then again use what is meaningful to improve the project. So it's happening, and it's going to the next levels with mobile apps that we're developing. So.
Yeah, I can think of 2 other examples. We talked a lot about the open data in London, which I think is a case like that. There's similar an open data initiative in Dublin, in Ireland, that is to just see what people would do with the data, and so it ends up being apps, and some of them are startups, and some of them are apps that the city is using, and that kind of thing. And then in some other parts of the world, it's taken maybe a different flavor, which is almost a hackathon kind of flavor, which is, turning a bunch of college students loose on a weekend with some city data sets to see what they might choose to do with it. We've done those in Nigeria. We've done them in a number of sort of interesting places. But it's citizen engagement at the data level. I can't think yet of an example like the one you give of a physical dabbling rather than a virtual dabbling.
The thing I'd love to just leave you with is when you actually open up the physical portion of a city, we did a project 2 years ago, urban prototyping with forest cities, where here was this development south, kind of near Mission Street, and they just cataloged kind of all the alleyways and kind of all the space, and we had like 60 groups working in fab labs and working with tech shop, physically building things out. And it's amazing how that engages not just the data weenies, but the urban planners and kind of designers, and that's now become a formal part of the planning process. And I think the data layer was kind of the first generation of all that. We open data. Actually opening up physical space is such a great invitation, and as you point out, a big alternative to just commenting or going to a city planning hearing.
Interesting.
David, did you want to add something?
I'll just add briefly. I mean, it's along those lines. One of the projects that we've just put a challenge out in London on urban logistics came to us because our transport teams were noticing an increase in light freight movements in London, a rapid increase. Now, that's small vans moving around the city, causing congestion. So the first question was to figure out why were there so many more small vans moving around London? And the answer was because there'd been, over the last 2 years, a rapid uptake in online shopping. And so the connectivity that the digital economy is giving is causing problems at the physical layer. And we then asked how much pollution is caused by this, an increase of 8% of CO2 emissions because of congestion caused by roads being blocked by light vans delivering an Amazon package to someone. And of course, our city slickers want instant gratification. You know, they're busy and overstressed. They want their food package to come when they're hungry. They want their book or whatever device it is they just bought to be there at 6 in the evening. The mayor's office in London, unlike some cities in some parts of the world, isn't going to put a diktat out saying that thou shalt not deliver between 5 in the evening and 8 in the evening because it's causing traffic congestion, nor is it going to try and figure out a better way of delivering packages. So we put £1 million on the table for teams to come, and we put the data there, and we said, figure out a model, micro-consolidation, you know, with the logistics companies, with companies like IBM working on these things, and come back to us and say, how are we going to deal with this issue? And we're in the middle of that process right at the moment. And I think there are many, many more challenges like that. You know, one of the things I want to see is a solution that works that we can practice in London and then sell to all the other cities around the world. We'll see how that goes.
This is the real data economy. There's a guy in the middle.
Bani Banerjee, Stanford Change Labs. Thank you for the excellent discussion. A lot of principles that I'm going away with, things like aligning with human motivation, reducing friction, data dashboards, et cetera. Question for you, Kathy. To what extent is your organization interested in cities in the developing world? And in the work out there, are there principles and heuristics that are emerging or patterns that are emerging that are different because of how different those problems are?
Great question. Thank you for giving me a chance to answer. Yeah, so the first answer is yes, absolutely. We are doing, I think, some of our best work in the developing world. And I think what's so interesting is that the problems are the same, but the answer has to show up different. And so for that, let me tell a quick story about it. It's a pilot project. We're not at scale yet, but it's a pilot project about traffic in Nairobi. So every city in the world has terrible traffic, and they're proud to say so, right? I will put Nairobi up against anything. I'll put them up against Bangalore, Delhi, or Beijing, right? So if you go to Nairobi, what you will see is it's an old British city with traffic circles, with roundabouts, no ring road. So every truck from Uganda that's going to the port at Mombasa goes through the city of Nairobi and around all those little traffic circles. So you'll see traffic circles with traffic signals on them, which is sort of an oxymoron to begin with. And then you'll see traffic police overriding the traffic signals based on what they can see, trying to make things better. It is, shall we say, not an optimized system. Right. So our research team in Tokyo heard this story from the guy that's running our research lab in Nairobi and said, oh, there must be something we can do. So part of what I like about the story is the technology, but part of it is that it's practical. So they took webcam data that exists in the city of Nairobi. They took a roadmap of the city of Nairobi. They took old-fashioned network analysis like we've used for routers for 20 or 30 years to see if they could fill in the missing data points and could backcast how traffic develops in Nairobi. And the answer is, yeah, they could. Then they started working on, can I predict how it develops? Can I suggest something better? And so in this pilot project, what happens is that every traffic cop, of course, has a cell phone. It's a feature phone. It's a dumb phone, right? But he has a phone. And so now onto his phone, he gets real-time advice based on a larger view than he can see with his eyes on what optimized might look like. But the practical piece is there's no new infrastructure. You know, we didn't go to the mayor of London and say, first deploy a bunch of sensors and then we'll talk, right? It's the available data and a way of getting the information to the humans that made sense. So we are doing a lot of work in the developing worlds. You know, cities are growing like mad, right? How do you provision services? How do you get water to them all? How do you get more people power, right? Those are the big problems, and it's really satisfying to do the work there. So, thank you for asking the question.
Another question?
Hi, Ray Solari of Rose Ryan Financial Consulting. I heard the term tonight, government as platform. I thought that was really interesting. I'd like to hear comments, what more that means, and does it imply guidelines for where, what business can do versus what government should do?
Thoughts? You can look at me because I said it, but you know.
I'm going to make a comment adjacent to that, which is that city governments need to modernize the way in which they think about administering the bits they're responsible for. And I say that because, you know, the 20th century, they've grown up in silos. You have the transport department, you have the energy department, you know, you have the policing department. And actually, what we're seeing are these issues cutting across horizontally, because the way cities are operating these days, the system of systems effects is meaning that they're intertwining, and often the opportunity is at the interfaces between what were previously very separate utilities and activities. And a lot of the problems are being caused because of perturbations in one side that affects another. I mean, I mentioned the electric vehicle thing. It's a bit of a trite comment, but if everyone turns up in an electric vehicle to the football game and plugs their car in, the lights might go out on the pitch because there's not enough electricity for the lighting. And that's partly true because at the moment, the electric power supplier won't necessarily see what's happening on the transport network. And that's because they weren't interested in it, and they didn't have any authority over it. And the city mayor's office has constructed siloed departments to govern these things. And so I think if we're going to move to the government platform, we've got to modernize the way in which these authorities are operating so that we can see the systems effects of what's happening in the city. And that's a big task, you know.
If I could offer a comment, I think government as platform allows third parties to do things that they couldn't before. We also see the opposite happening, which is third parties, you know, trying to put through legislation preventing cities from doing things, primarily for self-interest. I think you have to ask yourself whether or not that's a good idea. One more question before we go to the famous...
Hi there, thanks. I'm Mark Platchon from BMW. The question I have is sort of the long-term versus the short-term. It seems like you're talking about solving very important traffic and transportation problems that you can see now and that can be solved by working on the transport to solve the problem. On the other hand, you know, looking back, we created suburbia by building subways. You build cities, I guess the question is, do cities develop around transportation, or does transportation develop to solve cities afterwards?
How many chickens had to before the egg? I'm not sure how that works. Thoughts? Which way does the causal arrow point?
Well, there's a huge trend right now for transit-oriented development. It's a discipline on its own right now. So it seems to me like, I mean, there are economic drivers, social drivers, and then definitely transportation, but TOD now is a big deal. So, you know,
which means what? You design?
Which means you design your project around, let's say, a subway station. And then in that complex you design, it's a multi-use complex that has commercial, residential, and so that way it's a live and play environment, and then with easy access to the other parts of the city. So that's a huge trend. I mean, they're pushing for it. It saves on you know, transportation, less use of the car, and then everything is reachable within a 10-minute walk. It's kind of like the new urbanism concept.
Yeah.
See, another way of looking at this, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but is that mobility is almost a democratic right. It's certainly a liberation for people. And, you know, so a city has to figure out how to provide mobility or the means for being mobile. And if it doesn't figure that out, and if people in cities that aren't able to do it, that city's going to go into decline, and we've seen plenty of examples of that, which is why the big headache in places like London, how are we going to find 1.3 trillion pounds over the next 30 years to make sure that we've got modern infrastructure, because people don't find their jobs around the next street, you know. I mean, they have to move across the city. And they want to come in and out of the city, we all do. So I think those are some of I think transport actually, along with health and a couple of other things, are going to be absolute essential services to figure out.
Great. Let's finish with just a few quick lightning round questions, shall we? All right, quick questions, quick answers from each of you. We'll start here, Katharine.
Great.
What city would you recommend that people visit in order to experience this digital frontier?
I would go to Cambridge, Ontario.
David.
London.
Homer.
Make it a bit harder.
Homer. Should I guess? Jay?
Seattle or Chicago is pretty good also.
Okay.
I'll go with
Mike.
London.
Starting with Mike, what city would most benefit from moving toward the digital frontier?
Palo Alto, California.
New York.
Oh gosh, I mean, I think places like Tokyo really got to do that.
Beijing.
What is your favorite source of information about digital cities?
Whatever David wrote.
No, come on. I was going to say IBM, but
There, see, we're even.
we can't have a loving at the front.
Yeah, both of them.
Financial Times, I was going to say.
Mike?
No, I have to go along with it. David.
Mike, if you were mayor for a day of the city in which you live, what would be your highest priority for applying technology?
I think probably trying to get a data net so people can actually give information about the quality of their lives so they can have a feedback system.
Yeah, find a way to integrate all this massive amounts of information in one portal.
David?
I'd want to actually open up more educational information for people.
Katharine? Mayor Katharine.
Mayor Katharine, and I can pick whatever city I'm the mayor of?
I said the one in which you live, but...
The one in which I live. I would put a system in place so they're not hand typing the data into every app the city uses. Okay, I live very low on the food chain.
What worries you most about cities and technology?
Security.
Yeah, the failure mode.
Yeah, failure mode.
Mike?
A disaster of some sort, security breach.
What big company other than your own could do the most to help cities using technology? Mike?
I think actually the car companies have, these days, a lot of capability because they're creating another iPhone that's mobile. So
Okay.
I would say agencies, other than companies. Yeah.
You mean government agencies?
Yes.
Yeah.
I go for a design company, actually, or a design-rich with a consumer-facing side. I'm not just thinking about Apple either. I'm thinking about Dyson. I'm thinking about IDEO as a consulting designer. because I think they understand, I'm going on for more than a minute, I think they understand something about consumer use and different sorts of the consumer interface.
Kath?
I'd pick a telco. I think the telcos could be doing more to help us get useful data shipped around.
If you were about to do a startup addressing city topics, what would it be?
Public health.
Yeah, I'd go something on the health side, definitely. It's a good one.
Transportation.
Predictive analytics.
What's the most exciting application of tech to cities you've already seen? Mike?
That's hard to answer. I would say that probably what telcos are trying to do in communication and linking with transportation systems.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the smart cities initiatives of IBM and Cisco and their companies.
And
specific application, if we can.
For me, I would go for one of the ones in the remote monitoring of health, particularly for people in the paramedic side. Someone drops down in the street, you can monitor their vital signs.
Katharine?
I would pick the analytics that are helping police on the beat.
Yeah, good.
Predictive policing.
Yeah.
Finally, what problem that hasn't been addressed yet is the most important one?
Air pollution.
I'm going to say leadership.
Ooh, I like him.
Transportation.
On it.
You're an engineer.
Mike.
I got to go with David, leadership.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Katharine, David, Jay, Mike, thank you very much for your thoughtful conversation and for your candor. Michael, thank you very much for your expertise and masterful guidance of the conversation. As a small token of our thanks, we have for you the Churchill+Club speaker t-shirt. Thanks again to PARC and Osborne Clark. A video of this program will be available on the Churchill+Club YouTube channel shortly, so check it out and spread the word. And you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. See you next time. Good night.